I'm Beulah Wright. I am the curator of the museum that is run by the River John and Area Historical Society. The several members of the community got together and set it up quite a long time ago.
I became involved a number of years ago when my son was one of the students, and I felt there wasn't much support to the students. There was really our president, Linda Thompson Reed, who was, trying to do her best to help keep things going. So when my son came along and he became the student, I realized they needed some help. So I would come over and try and do things to give him a hand or get pictures reproduced for them and that type of thing. So once you start, it's really hard to get out. But I have enjoyed it, and I've learned a lot of the history of the area. History that I wasn't even aware of before. I knew some of it, but I certainly wasn't aware of it all. So I've enjoyed it. So I've been glad to get involved. The museum here in the community, I think, makes people more aware of what has gone on before. Now, if people come by, they think this might be a sleepy little community, nothing goes on. But if you look at the history, say 100 plus years ago, definitely more than 100 years ago, it was a very happening place. And actually, at one point, it was larger than New Glasgow is. So that says something. We are a very important shipbuilding area in the province. Very important. We produced a lot of ships here. And because of that, there were so many trades that were brought in to work in the shipyards. And 100 years ago, there was 5 stores in River John, 5 grocery stores. Would you believe it now? No.
5 churches.
5 churches.
There was all sorts of different clubs,
Yes.
and that sort of thing. There was different industries that was included. Because of the shipyards, they needed lots of blacksmith shops, and there was lumber mills, and all kinds of spin-off industries as well as the shipbuilding itself. This building itself is very historical, even before it was a museum. It was originally the Church of Christ Disciples Baptist Church, and it was the very first Church of Christ in Atlantic Canada. In 1808, James Murray came from Scotland with his wife and his wife's sister. And they landed in Pictou, and for a while he stayed in Pictou and worked as a tailor. Then he moved out this way to River John, towards River John, the back shore. He had never had any formal ministerial training, but he was very interested and followed the Baptist Church, especially a sect of the Baptist Church that believed the congregation should have more say in the church than just the pastor. So he set up the church, and in 1816 he baptized his wife, his sister-in-law, and a couple of others at that time. That was the first baptism, so it really dates back to 1816. At that time, there was no building. The congregation met at different houses of the different members. There were quite a few members. There was Goulds and Sillers and different ones, that were a Baptist and followed him. He kept this going for quite some time until his wife died. And when his wife died, he took his family and moved to Ohio.
Oh.
Probably because of losing her, you know. His one of his daughters was already married in River John, and she stayed here. So she was still a connection to River John. The building itself was probably built in 1865. And it was never a very large congregation, but through the years, of course, it varied just like any other congregation. There'd be more sometimes and sometimes less. That went on for many years until about 1960, somewhere around that time. The congregation had decreased. There were very few members left living. And they didn't really want anything to happen to the church. They wanted it preserved. So the members that were left, mainly the Roberts family, decided to give it to the Historical Society. The Historical Society was being formed just about that time, too. And they did. They passed it over to us with the hope that it would be preserved, that the church would stand for the memory of the church for many, many years.
Do you remember when the shipbuilding started first in River John? Was it
1860.
1860? Okay. So we had how many shipyards? We had the
Kitchen shipyard.
Kitchen, which is on the picture side,
yes.
the eastern side. The Dwyer was further down, was it not?
Yes. He had not as much a formal shipyard, but he built ships there. There was a Robert McKay that really built the first one. Mm-hmm. And then there was Mackenzie's, McLennan's, and Muckler.
And Mackenzie McClellan were on the opposite shore.
They were on the western side, yes.
Muckler, I'm not sure where they were.
Muckler was close to the bridge and around in the same area. I would imagine it was very much where the dock is now.
Oh, okay.
In that area,
okay.
Because it was on that side of the bridge.
That's right, and because the old bridge was further up.
Yes,
than
the old bridge went straight across.
Yes, and it's the new bridge is further down on the Tatamagouche side now compared to what the old one was.
Now the Kitchen shipyard was on the eastern side. Mm-hmm. It was the only one on the eastern side, except for a couple of ships that were built further down the Cape, at Cape John. It was a very large operation. The Mackenzie shipyard was directly across where the bridge goes over now. Mm-hmm. That's where the Mackenzie shipyard was. The McLennan shipyard was rather opposite where the post office is now.
That's right.
Up the shore a little bit.
Now, at one time when they were when they had ships being built, was it not said that the Mackenzie and the Kitchen ships could nearly touch? Those were the large ones that were built. I can't remember the names of them.
Sometimes there were two or more ships being built in the harbor at the same time. And the harbor is very nice, very deep, very good sheltered area for the shipbuilding. But it would have been just a little crowded because they were pretty close.
Yes. And I know if somebody came and looked at our harbor now, our river, they would wonder about it. But apparently there have been changes in the river since the, say, 1950s when Department of Highways did some excavation and it silted in the lower river.
Yes.
But it still has a good channel right now.
That was all good and deep area.
Yes.
And now, sometimes at low tide you can see the reeds and the river, but and there's a sandbar that's reaching very far across towards the church now at that point. But that was not there at that time. There was also quite a bit of cooperation between the shipbuilders in Pictou. Well, of course, James Kitchen was originally in Pictou, and they had then started the businesses here. So there was ones like Curver, that was a shipbuilder in New Glasgow and Pictou, and sometimes had a ship built in the Kitchen shipyard as well.
Now, then we go back to the families of some of these shipbuilders. So we have Alexander Mackenzie, and we have Alexander Campbell in Tatamagouche.
Yes,
They worked together to some degree. They were married to sisters.
yes,
And then you have the McClellan shipyard and the Mackenzie shipyard here in River John. They were closely aligned. They also had marriage connections.
yes.
Was it Alexander Mackenzie's daughter who married Charles?
Charles McClellan.
Right,
Yes.
that's right. And then you, as we were talking about Muckler, he and his sons,
Yes.
his sons followed him.
Muckler actually built several ships here in River John and was one of the prominent builders. But then he moved to Brule, and his shipyard was moved to shipyard and everything, and he built quite a lot more vessels in.
Now, what about the ships, some of the ships that were built here, the more prominent or well-known
The more
ones?
famous ones. Well, of course, there was a Warrior, which was the largest vessel built on this shore of Nova Scotia. And there was two Warriors. Kitchen shipyard, they had a Warrior first in the beginning, and then there was the very large one. There was a bit of competition, friendly competition, between the builders, and the McClellans were building a ship, the Caldera, and the Kitchen shipyard was building the second Warrior. And it's rather interesting, the Caldera was measured first for tonnage, and the tonnage is not the weight or whatever, it's the space in the vessel. And the Caldera came out on top, was the top vessel. The Kitchen shipyard had not finished the Warrior, so they added a poop deck to the Warrior, which gave them extra tonnage, and the Warrior was the largest vessel ever launched. Just as it happened, they were the last ones to launch and the last ones to be measured. You mentioned earlier about the Argentina. The Argentina was the one that was the fastest. The Caldera, the Cambrai, the Mary F. Anderson was the very last ship that was launched in River John. And it was launched in 1918. The shipbuilding had become decline because there was metal ships being, steel ships being built in other areas and so on. So it was dropping. But then the First World War broke out, and they needed all the vessels they could get. So they started, there was a couple more ships built. The Mary F. Anderson was the very last one, and it was launched in 1918.
Now, Mary F. Anderson, if I recall this correctly, Mackenzie had a number of sons that had gone to war, and he wanted to do his bit in the war effort, so he wanted to build another ship. But he did not have the money, money and the lumber maybe. So he recruited lumber from a gentleman down in, I think it was Guysborough County, and the condition this man gave was the ship had to be named after his daughter. So that is how she came
to be Mary F. Anderson.
And I think that you are right, that was the last ship.
Yes,
They just
the
didn't-
Cyril T was built too in that meantime and sold to make extra funds to finish the Mary F. Anderson.
Oh, okay. I didn't remember
It was
that.
a smaller vessel,
Okay.
and it was launched around that time too, just before.
So we do have some pictures of Mary F. Anderson.
We have Mary F. Anderson, we have the Caldera, we we have in my binder, I have a picture of the warrior. In fact, we have quite a few vessels and at least one captain and several builders, photos of them in our museum.
That's good. Another individual that River John is quite proud of is Anna Sutherland Bissell. Anna was born in 1846 here in the village. She was the daughter of William Sutherland, a sea captain, and his wife, Eleanor Putnam. When she was about 4 years old, they left here and went down to Michigan. And at the age of 19, she married Melville Bissell. And he was in business with his father, who had a dry goods business at the time. And crockery was part of the business. And the crockery would arrive in crates packed in straw. And Melville had allergies, so it was very dusty. So Melville had seen an earlier prototype of a carpet sweeper, and he looked at it and he said he could pick up some issues with it that he felt he could improve on. Apparently he was quite mechanically inclined. So he and Anna decided, yes, he'd work on that because Anna was getting tired of the dust and he thought he could improve in this. So they worked upstairs above the shop, probably in their living quarters, and he tried to do a better prototype of this. And I read that Anna and Melville took boar's hairs and they glued them onto this roller, and then he built the casing, which was wooden at the time, and they put them together. So after they had a few of these made, they went to, I don't know, doesn't matter what community. Anyway, he went up one side of the street, she went up the other side of the street. And when they met at the end, he was so excited. He'd given away all these samples to merchants, and she said, I sold all my samples to merchants. So at that point, they decided they would put her in charge of the financial aspect. He would do the manufacturing part of the process. They were a good team. And then he died prematurely, doesn't matter what year, 1880 sometime.
After they had 5 children.
After 5 children. So Anna was left with this company, and then she had all these people coming to her. They wanted to buy this company because they could see the success. But Anna was shrewd. Being of good Scottish stock, she said, no, I can do it. I know the business because I worked with it with Melville. So she kept it up and she ran it. Brought up 5 children, was well involved in the community. And she was well known. I think she was one of the first women entrepreneurs and first women head of a large company down in the States. Let me see what else about.
She was the only woman that was in the association for carpets and cleaners.
Okay, that's
Yeah,
true.
yes,
That
yeah.
is true.
Yeah.
And she respected her employees, and I think they had a mutual respect for her. She brought in benefits that were unheard of at the time, but being a widow, bringing up children, she probably realized the importance of supporting the family. If you support your family, then you get a good employee. So one of the displays that we have here in the museum, Beulah, that I'm personally proud of is has to do with my grandfather, Daniel Hugh Sutherland. So my grandfather, as you remember, was well known in the community as Colonel Dan. So his history goes back. He was born here in the village. His family were involved in railway building, and Granddad built railways in Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, Ontario, Saskatchewan, Quebec. Anyway, the First World War was on, and Granddad was out in Saskatchewan, and he decided, well, he was going to come back to Nova Scotia, he and his wife, Emily. So they came back, and he decided he would join the war effort, so to speak. He had gone down to Canso, and he was working at the telegraph station there. Then he enlisted. After he enlisted, he decided he would go to, maybe he didn't decide. After Granddad had enlisted in Canso, he had an opportunity to go to Aldershot and take officers training because he had quite a bit of experience in construction. So he was down there training. Now go back a couple of steps. First World War, of course, is on, as I just said. And they were recruiting. You know, the government was recruiting. They needed new soldiers and to replace those who had gone over. Well, at that time, we had a large population in comparison to the rest of Canada of African Canadians. So these black men had gone to recruiting stations to offer, you know, themselves as part of the war effort. No, I'm not going to take you. You're the wrong color. Oh, my men won't fight with you because you're black. It was a terrible thing. Real racism. And it was prejudice. You know, they didn't give these men a chance. Anyway, there were white officers and there were white soldiers who thought this was not good. The public in general, they were looking for more recruits to go overseas. And the general public were starting to say, well, what's wrong? Why can't we take these men? So went into Robert Borden, who was prime minister at the time, into his office, and he said, okay, compromise, when he talked with his Sam Hughes, his war minister, and that, and they decided they would form a black labor battalion. The men themselves had wanted to be part of a fighting unit, but no, this was not to be, so they took a labor battalion. So my grandfather was asked in July of 1916, would he take this on because of Granddad's experience? Granddad said, okay, but it has to be in a construction one because that was his area of expertise. He wanted to be aligned with a railway construction unit, but railway construction unit wouldn't accept them because they were black, even as part of them. So Granddad had found a space along the Pictou waterfront, which has now become a historical site, National Historic Site, and they recruited there, used that as their headquarters for about 3 months until it was getting crowded. And then they went over to Truro and they found another area that they could use. It was a larger area, and also it was a railway center in Truro, so it was easier for recruits to come in. So they continued bringing men in. They trained them while the officers continued to recruit across the country. So in I think it was January 1917, they needed more rails for work over in Europe because they were running out of steel and they ran out of rails. So they had a couple of railway lines up in New Brunswick that weren't being used as much. So some of the men from the number 2 were sent up in the dead of winter to lift these rails. So terrible conditions they worked in. Anyway, they did the work. So they were the only battalion in Canada that did war work on Canadian soil. And then all these rails were shipped over. So in March 25th, 1917, they shipped out of Halifax and went across the ocean during the worst of submarine activity. And in fact, because it was a black unit going over, it was suggested they go by themselves. But no, men of truer disposition, so to speak, they said no, that wasn't to happen. So they were sent across with a convoy group, and the conditions were not good at the time. They landed in England, trained some more in Seaforth, but they weren't quite strong enough for a battalion, so they were split up a bit. So some of their officers were sent out to other places or to other units. The number 2 was shipped over to the Jura Mountains area to do work for part of the war effort, obviously. They built railway lines, they did construction work, they dug tunnels, they dug trenches, they worked on electrical systems for camps. They did a lot of the basic needs that the war effort needed for other soldiers to continue the work. and make it a successful war effort. And I know they also volunteered, even at that point, to become a fighting unit. They would be, it's recorded in the war diaries that they were actually training on Sundays when they weren't doing other things with their guns. Granddad was going to make sure they were prepared to fight if they were given the opportunity. They were never given the opportunity. I think there was a very few black men that did manage to get into other ranks and do some work. But anyway, they were well received for the work that they did do. They came back after the war had ceased, and they came back, no war, no fanfare. You hear the stories that there was parades and everything for other groups that came back, but in hearing what I have heard from some of these descendants of the black soldiers, there was very little fanfare given to them. And in fact, they were still treated as second-class citizens despite their magnificent work overseas. And when they came back, I should tell you this, that Captain White, who was the chaplain of the unit, he was the only black officer that in the one, or at least Captain White was one of the very few black officers in the British Army at the time, or the British Empire at the time.
And he was the chaplain for the group, the battalion, was he?
Yes, he was. Yes.
Yes.
And he was a very fine chaplain. My grandfather thought a lot of him. And it's interesting how these things go around. His son went on to sing in Sing Along Jubilee, Lorne White.
Yes.
And Lorne White,
Portia was
yes,
very famous as a
contralto.
contralto.
Yes, she
very
was world famous. So after they came back, Granddad tried to get back into work life again, and but he always had a fond spot for the men of the Black Battalion. He highly respected them, what they had done during the war. So Granddad was a saver, and Granddad was a picture taker, as you probably remember growing up here in River John. Anyway, we had quite a few pictures that he had saved, and since then, when they started having when they had the 103rd anniversary of this Black Battalion's formation, I was approached by, museums and different interest groups, and I went rooting through the house, and I did find quite a bit of stuff that I knew about but didn't really know about. I knew it was there, but I hadn't really paid attention to it, and that's when I became more aware of the No. 2 Construction Battalion. But because my grandfather was smart enough, he saved this stuff, and it's been able to come back into public viewing again and public's knowledge.